2 weeks after the meeting in the laundry room with Reggie and Coop, I passed my final exams and officially became an honor guard. I'll never forget those guys. They were there for me. Their support gave me the courage to continue, and they put themselves on the line for me that night in the laundry room. If we'd been seen together talking or praying, it was their necks as well as mine that were at stake. That's what friends do. Put themselves on the line for one another. I thank God that all my life caring people have been there for me. My sister Linda defended me against all odds. My mother refused to take the advice of the school counselor to institutionalize me. Mrs. Sherlock, as well as so many other of my elementary and secondary teachers, stubbornly worked with me when it seemed impossible that I'd ever learn. My religion teacher showed me a world of need beyond Portland's street scene. Neighbors and church members saw more in me than I could ever see in myself. My grandmother made it a point to teach me proper table etiquette. When her husband died after World War II, Grandma obtained a degree in teaching from Prairie Bible College, then headed for Liberia as a missionary. Before her death in 1992, she started 13 girls' schools. She'd tell how young men would walk more than 100 miles to meet and marry one of her girls. Today, a former prime minister of Liberia is married to one of Grandma's girls. Whenever Grandma came home to America to raise money for her schools, she'd give large dinners at our home and invite some of the most important people in the area. In the process, she became good friends with Billy and Ruth Graham. It was at one such fundraising dinner that she predicted my birth. At the end of the meal, Grandma stood to give a toast and say thank you, and she added, "The Lord has told me that next year at this time, Zelma, you, and Kenner will have a new baby boy." My mother laughed. "That's impossible. 5 children is quite enough." Old doctors and preachers in the Portland area today remember that dinner. They love to remind me of my grandma's prediction. Years later, Grandma told me that she'd shared only half of what God told her. The other half was that I would be a preacher, that I would carry on her mission of helping people and caring for those in need. I'm not telling anyone until God brings it to pass. At these dinners, Grandma would sit me down beside her whenever I reached for something without saying please or thank you or excuse me. She'd slap my hands and say, "Terry, I have a feeling that one day you will find yourself dining with the President of the United States. So you'd better learn to use proper manners now." At that time, I never dreamed that her predictions would become a reality, that her lessons would take me all the way to the President's table. We all need help from others, someone to keep us focused on what is important. My neighbors, my family, my Christian friends and church members, even the Boy Scouts and the Cub Scouts guided me during my early years. When I needed help, all I had to do was ask, and someone would be there for me. To ask for help isn't always the easiest lesson to learn. I had a friend who needed help with an addiction, but he was too embarrassed to ask for it. When the subject came up, I reminded him that I was there for him, but he declined my offer. If people were to find out what I'm really doing, they wouldn't like me anymore, he confessed. Because he didn't get help when he needed it, his problem grew. And before long, everyone knew about his addiction. So many people would have been eager to help him if he had only been able to swallow his pride enough to ask. One particular teacher in academy helped me when I needed help the most. Floyd Matula. When I was a teenager, my lifestyle spelled disasters. Party, drugs, and alcohol threatened to destroy me as they had so many other teens. Floyd Matula made the difference for me. Mr. Matula influenced me in two ways. First, he epitomized the word gentleman. Going into the cafeteria, he held the door open for others. He would help seat the women at the table before seating himself. If a girl approached the table, he would honor her by standing. I noticed these things. I also noticed that everyone liked him. I decided to imitate Mr. Matula. Maybe I reasoned, if I were nice like Mr. Matula, everyone would like me and my troubles would all go away. This decision changed my life. As my behavior improved, so did my popularity. I went from being one of the underdogs at school to being popular. I liked having my classmates say, "Terry is a nice guy." In time, I made up my mind that I wanted these qualities permanently in my life. I spent hours talking with Mr. Matula. Between breaks and basketball practice, I'd slip away to his office to talk. I would voluntarily stay after school to spend time with him. As a result, he influenced me in a second way. Mr. Matula accepted me as I was. He never prejudged me. But this time, I'd started drinking and partying with my buddies. To make spending money, I sold shots of alcohol out of my school locker. Going to the shopping mall behind the school during school hours was not allowed. But I cut a hole in the school fence and charged the other students $1 each to use it. I thought I was a big shot. I determined to bury the injured 7-year-old boy inside me beneath tons of bravado and attitude. But my past continued to haunt me. In my senior year, when my SAT scores came back listing me as number 4 from the bottom of the 48 in my class, my teachers suggested that I take the test a second time. They thought something must have been wrong with the results. I knew there was nothing wrong with the test. The imperfections were in me. All the big noise and flashy attitude I could manifest couldn't hide the truth. I was incapable of learning. Did Mr. Matula know what I was doing behind the scenes? What my life was like outside the classroom? Maybe, maybe not. But he must have had his suspicions. I do know he never condemned me. Whenever he confronted me about my problems, he'd say, "Terry, I trust you'll do the right thing." Or, "I know you know what is right, but the choice is always yours." As a result, I felt comfortable telling him about any problem on my mind. Mr. Matula involved me in the speaking seminar program that he conducted. Each weekend, he took students to speak in various churches in the Portland area. I'd given my first presentation while in grade school, a sermon on David and Goliath. I found that I enjoyed public speaking. Mr. Matula picked up on that. I did well until I tried to combine late-night partying with speaking engagements early the next morning. I'd go out drinking with my buddies, sometimes all night, then call my teacher in the morning and make excuses that I wasn't feeling well, which was all too true. Sometimes I'd say that I had to take my mother to church, or that I was too tired, or that I had an obligation at my own church. To my surprise, Mr. Matula wouldn't back down. "Terry," he said, "God really wants you to come with us today. If you don't, then your part of the program will not be filled. The other students are counting on you." I knew that he realized that I'd been out partying. If I continued to say no, he'd bring the entire van of students to my house, knock on our door, and ask my mother if I could come out, because the other kids were counting on me. In time, I stopped partying the night before I was to speak, because I didn't want to disappoint him. Eventually, I stopped partying altogether. The influence of one caring teacher who refused to give up on me. I know that if it were not for Mr. Matula having faith in me, I would never have finished academy. I probably never I would have never reached out for help on my own. His persistence made the difference. The man had a way of preaching to me through his lifestyle rather than his words. His quiet influence followed me to the White House. I believe that I became a favorite escort there because of the politeness I learned from him, while many of the honor guards had to learn the finer points of courtesy after joining the guard. Mine came from years of being around Floyd Matula, holding the door without being asked, looking after people's well-beings, seating the generals' wives. The word got around. When they needed an escort for a special ceremony, I was often the first on the list called. When I finished at Oakwood College, I returned to Portland. I thanked Mr. Matula for all the time he had invested in me. He responded, "Terry, I could see that in your heart you wanted to do the right thing. For a man to admit he needs help is difficult. His machismo makes him believe he can do anything. He can handle life. He has all the answers. And if he also carries a heavy load of failure that he's trying to hide, to ask for help becomes a monumental struggle with all his fabricated image." I needed help. And thanks to Floyd Matula, I learned to turn to God first with my problems. I discovered that God waits eagerly and willingly to do for me more than I could possibly ask. And in each difficulty, he was waiting for me to turn to him. You see, God is a perfect gentleman. He never forces himself on us. He never forces us to be good, to be loving, to turn our lives around. But when we're ready, he's there to make that turnaround easy. One day during my senior year of high school, I was in downtown Portland. I found a scrap of litter on the sidewalk. From my years of experience as a Boy Scout, I picked it up, planning to toss it into the nearest trash bin. I glanced at it. It was a religious tract. On the cover it said, "God loves you." Now, I'd been hearing "God loves you" my entire life. I'd been singing the children's song "Jesus Loves Me" since I was barely able to speak. But that day, at that moment in my life, the words spoke to me. I sat down on the nearest park bench and read the tract from cover to cover. The flyer said that God had a plan for my future. For regardless of Floyd Matula's faith in me, regardless of my English teacher's determination to help me through senior literature class, regardless of the city councilwoman's predictions, regardless of my mother's prayers and my grandmother's fretting, I knew the real Terry, the failure, the goof up, the dummy. Could God really have something better in mind for me? On that park bench in downtown Portland, I asked God for help. I was tired of trying to do it on my own. I couldn't play the macho game, the Joe Cool guy any longer. When I told my best buddies of my decision, they scoffed. "Terry, you can't leave us," one of them said. "You hang out with us. You party with us. What do you mean you want God in your life? Aren't we enough?" I looked at my friends and thought, no, not anymore. A short time later, Barry Black, a Navy chaplain, held revival meetings in the area. I made up my mind during one of the meetings that my life needed to change. I would follow God. After the meeting that night, my friends showed up at the church to take me to a party where I knew drugs and booze would flow. I told him I wasn't going, that I'd given my life to God. God? My buddies laughed. Come on, Terry. Stop kidding around. Besides, you gotta come with us. You're the life of the party. I refused. They tried everything from mocking to reasoning to anger, but I didn't go. Months later, while I was in the police academy, my mother called and told me that one of my buddies had been killed in a high-speed chase in a stolen car. The seat in the car most twisted and destroyed was the seat I usually occupied whenever we cruised together. As for the third guy in our trio, Mike, he wasn't in the car that night, and for a good reason. I mentioned him earlier in the chapter about dead ends. He's the one whose friends dropped acid in his drink at a party. He lives out his adult life, functioning as best he can with the mind of a toddler. God saw me that day in the park in downtown Portland, I have no doubt. And when I turned my face toward him, he gathered me in his arms. He said, "Hello, son. I'm here. I've been waiting so long for you." But Father," I cried, "I'm the kid they said was too stupid to learn. I'm the mental retard, remember?" And the Lord just chuckled. "No problem, son, no problem. I've got you covered by my grace." I had no idea that God would take this kind of kid who couldn't read and who stuttered whenever he became nervous and make him a guard for the President of the United States. Later, as God opened doors, revealing new and exciting pathways for my life, I remembered a story that Grandma told me when I was a child. She'd just returned home from Liberia for one of her fundraising trips. During an uprising against the government in that country, Grandma and the girls from one of the schools had to flee for their lives in the middle of the night. When morning dawned, Grandma found herself and the children far from civilization, huddled against the cold. Discouraged and hungry, she felt like giving up. Her heart wept for the cold and hungry children. In frustration, she closed her eyes and cried out to God. "Lord," she said, "I really need your help." A tug on her sleeve caused her to open her eyes. Beside her stood a shivering little girl. "Mama?" The child looked up in Grandma's face. "Didn't you tell us that God is always there for us? Didn't you tell us the story of how he helped Moses cross the sea and freed Joseph from prison and helped Ruth find Boaz?" Grandma gathered the little girl in her arms. "Yes, child, yes. But unfortunately, I'm not Joseph. I'm not Moses, and I'm not Ruth." "But isn't God the same God?" The child's simple answer silenced Grandma's questioning. At this point in the story, my grandma would always pause. A broad smile would spread across her face. Shame on me. Hadn't God already kept us safe through the long night as we hid from the soldiers? It took a wee girl to remind me that God is still the same God. Although I remembered Grandma's antidotes and my mother's instructions, I had to discover this God for myself. I had to read for myself how God rescued Joseph from prison, how he preserved Daniel in the lion's den. I had to relive the story about how God delivered Daniel's friends from the raging fires without a whiff of smoke lingering on their clothing or a hair on their heads singed. How he gave sight to those who were blind and life to those who were dead. I had to discover for myself that God does keep his promises, and he does it with style. I didn't know as I scrubbed toilets for Sergeant Collier that I would become the first African American honor guard from my home state of Oregon. I didn't realize at that time that I would also go down in President's honor guard history as the first guard with a disability, or that the guard would extend my tour of duty 3 times, or that I would serve the longest of any honor guard member up to that time. I received 12 badges, medals, and citations in less than 4 years, as well as a promotion to sergeant. I didn't know. God will do incredible things with a willing but dyslexic young man declared unable to educate. Before I left military life to attend college, Grandma's prophecy came true. I attended a special breakfast for the top honor guards at the White House, hosted by President Reagan. But even Grandma couldn't have imagined that I would be privileged to meet every president since Richard Nixon, as well as witness 2 inaugurations and 2 presidential funerals, those of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. Yesterday, today, forever, God will always stand by me.